Good morning, Learning Associates. So I made this quick video as promised to provide a little bit of support for the chapter from the Senso and D'Angelo text that's entitled Oppression and Power. So I'm just going to overview a couple of concepts that are here in the chapter, but I would argue that sometimes sort of hearing those talked through is beneficial, and then I have some examples that I think might also help you as you begin to read this chapter or engage further in this chapter, and also work on the discussion board post. So, first off, I just want to I just want to say out loud, right? Because I think that's important. Our definition of oppression, which we distinguish between prejudice and discrimination. So on page 61, the authors write, the prejudice and discrimination of one social group against another backed by institutional power. Okay, so it's not just the disposition that we all have around a particular social group, right? Particular social groups, but the institutional power to operationalize those dispositions in ways that impact the material conditions, right? The lived experiences of other social groups, marginalized social groups. Oppression occurs when one group is able to enforce its prejudice and discrimination throughout society because it controls the institutions. Oppression occurs at the group or macro level. So we're not talking about day-to-day interactions of prejudice and discrimination, which are actually examples of what we would call microaggressions, which is a whole other category, but related to prejudice and discrimination, particularly relative to people of color and women of color. So oppression is not the one-on-one. Sexism, racism, classism, ableism, and heterosexism are specific forms of oppression. I would add to that list linguicism, right? Adultism, and anti-Semitism. And if you kind of skip ahead in this chapter, there is a definition for, or there's a definition for sort of what that means on page 64, what those categories, what those isms are, and the sort of the act and the dominant group and the marginalized group or minoritized group that experiences those forms of oppression. So there's an understanding that Senso and D'Angelo are trying to convey that there's unequal power among social groups. And again, daily interaction or situational experiences are examples of microaggression. So I might label a particular experience as microaggressive. However, if that experience is also tied to social institutions that I'm involved in, right? Then that is an example of the enforcement of oppression for other folks who are of a similar group that I am. So let me give you an example of what oppression might look like. Oppression in a school setting is, for example, the overrepresentation of students of color in special education. So several folks have written about that. This book, Case Studies of Minority Student Placement in Special Education, these authors make that argument. Also, the overrepresentation of Black males in particular. So Anne Arnett Ferguson writes this book, Bad Boys, and their overrepresentation in sites that are connected to punishment in schools. So the detentions, the suspensions, the expulsions, and also earning the label of bad boys in schools. But in addition to that, right, being placed in these sort of areas of punishment or as a result of their behavior, rather than the attempts to understand the conditions that lead to their behavior. And then Michelle Alexander writes about the overrepresentation of Black and Latino men in particular in the prison industrial complex, right? So those are examples of oppression on a large scale. Sensory and D'Angelo also write about internalized dominance, and I think this is an interesting concept. So I just want to go to that page. Internalized dominance on page 71, and then internalized oppression. They juxtapose the two. So internalized dominance is the belief that privilege is natural, it's earned, it's entitled. So sort of along the lines of a myth of meritocracy, right? So I sort of deserve to have this placement in this social group. And then that leads to actions like segregation from self-segregation from communities that of people outside of a particular social group, or a disinterest in the life experiences of others, or what we call others, and I'm using others in the anthropological sense, and a dismissiveness about the narratives of others, right? It's also the belief that one group is more qualified, internalized oppression. On the other hand, right, so one may actually believe some of the hegemonic ideologies, and I'll sort of get to hegemonic ideologies in a few minutes, but believe that this is true. So the belief by a minoritized group member, or by minoritized groups, that the dominant group is just more qualified, right? Or sort of enacting these groups enacting forms of low expectation, or believing that a group believing that the struggles with social institutions are their own. So when we say social institutions, we're thinking about schools and government, public facilities also, right? These are also examples of institutions. The belief that sort of if one enacts the attributes associated, or the characteristics associated with the dominant group, sort of if you just did these things, right? If you just wore your clothes in this way, or if you just spoke language in these ways, if you you spoke proper English, for example, then you would be successful. So, this sign is one that is a billboard I've seen in Atlanta, but I've also seen this in schools. So, it shows a man with his degree on one hand, a Black man, and then on the other hand, somebody sagging his pants. So show your mind, not your behind, right? As if like all you have to do is pull your pants up and you will get your degree. And we know that it's much more complicated than just pull your pants up, right? And furthermore, why does pulling our pants up even matter? So we saw that in the video as well with Dropout and the hat. Hegemony is defined on page 73, and I think that Sensory and D'Angelo take a complicated term, a complicated concept, and try to make it as clear as possible. And so my suggestion for you is to sort of work your way through that part of the text. Hegemony is the imposition of the dominant group ideology. So oppression is the force, hegemony is the ideology. So it makes it difficult to resist or believe in, to resist the belief in the dominant group. So it's a mechanism of social control that is achieved through conditioning rather than physical force or intimidation. So they give the example of school, which I think is also relevant to the question that you'll answer for this week's discussion board. So schools socializing students to conform and act in different ways through time, right? A control of one's time, through systems of rewards and punishment, through academic tracking, through standardized curriculum or white-centered curriculum, through detention systems. Those are all forms of mechanisms of social control that Sensoy and D'Angelo and many other educational researchers suggest exist, and that term, that concept, emerges out of the work of Michael Foucault, Derrida, all of those. If you go back to that PowerPoint that we presented in class, you'll see the category where Foucault and Derrida, I believe, are both listed. And those are, these critical social theorists that we draw from. They're in the Frankfurt School, so Habermas, Marcuse, Marx Weber, Emile Durkheim, and then from more contemporary standpoint, Angela Davis, who writes extensively about the prison industrial complex, and Louis Lacan as well. Is another scholar that's in the Frankfurt School of Thought that sort of aligns with these thoughts about hegemony, not to suggest that other authors are not similarly engaging in this work. So for this week, your discussion board post, I think, is provocative, but I also think that in looking at your work thus far in the semester, that y'all can handle this, and I'm excited to see what you begin to develop. So I'm just pulling this up on my end so I could just sort of read it out loud. I think this, again, this is a strategy that I've used in my own work. As I attempt to sort of make sense of writing tasks and engaging in my own scholarship. So taking several times to sort of make sense of what I'm being asked to do, and also then making sense of what I'm writing before I click send. So I'll just say this. In chapter 5 of Sensoy and D'Angelo, the authors explain that oppression is the manifestation of historical legacy, ideological beliefs, and institutionalized control. And you'll notice that on pages 67 through 68, they sort of explain each of those components in detail. In your post, I want you to draw from those parts of the text to further explicate your specific understanding of the bolded terms, of those three terms as they relate to oppression. So how do you understand what is meant by historical legacy, ideological beliefs, and institutionalized control? And you can add culture into that. And you should be citing the text in your explanation. So I kind of put at the end to make sure that you are you're trying to work on, to practice the use of your APA conventions in your citation. So that you're using your citations correctly. The second part of that question is to discuss the relevance of oppression to one aspect of public education with which you are familiar. So different individuals in the course have different experiences with funding, with special education, with curriculum, with tracking, with working with emergent bilingual students, with working as administrators. I've mentioned some other ones in terms of like school discipline policies. So take one of those topics and discuss how that exemplifies, right, systemic oppression within the complex of school. If you're looking for a topic like, well, I don't know, I know that this exists, but I don't know what the concept is. Like, what do I name this, right, happening in school? We talked a little bit about this in class last week. You can go to the ed section in any of your major newspapers. I listed a few here, but, I would suggest a major newspaper because that article is going to have some teeth and it's going to have some meat to work with. and you might look for those for an article that is related to education, related to youth, and might possibly some further information about the topic, so you can sort of gain a larger perspective. Basically, the purpose of this week is to, number one, work through your definition, your understanding of oppression, right? So again, distinguishing oppression between prejudice and discrimination. And then second, taking that working understanding and applying it to a current educational issue that is frustrating for you, is that you're curious about, that could potentially down the road be an area that you further research. So I want you to already sort of be getting your minds ready for next steps in terms of developing a problem of practice. We're early in the game, but I also want you to remember and that this is a 3-year program, so we can sort of begin to explore these topics in ways that are strategic and intentional, because you may return to some aspect of them at a later date. Okay, so I hope that is helpful to get you started in this study this week. I look forward to reading your posts and your responses on D2L. Be sure, let me just say as a last note, with your responses, we don't have to sort of agree with one another. Go back to those guidelines in the first chapter of Sensoi and D'Angelo, so we can sort of probe and challenge one another, and obviously respectfully, we can ask for evidence, right? So let's move beyond those personal anecdotes and sort of sources for evidence to support what we're saying. We can sort of be transparent about our social positions and how they inform our perspectives about these particular topics. So as you're formulating your response to your peers, go back to that first chapter of Sensoi and D'Angelo and think about those guidelines as a way to shape a response that's moving us beyond just, I like the way you did this and I like the way you do that, right? We can sort of engage in a productive, a generative, and extensive conversation. Oh, last part. I gave you an extension for this chapter. So your discussion board post is due, I believe, on, let me just go back, I believe it's due next Saturday instead of tomorrow. I think that just makes more sense. Yes, it is due Saturday the 29th. We called it at 5 p.m. so that I can have an opportunity to read it myself in preparation for class next week. So Saturday the 29th at 5 p.m. All right, I look forward to seeing you or reading your work virtually. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to send me an email, pabon@kutztown.edu. Okay, have a great week.